Sweden in World War II. The Navy. Procurement, Modernization and Doctrine, 1925 to 1945. Procurement and Modernization. The Swedish Navy had a substantial force during the First World War, but heavy duty of ships meant that it was somewhat run down and in need of modernization after the war. Some new ships had been added. The Sverige class of coastal defense ships had started coming into service. 3 were built between 1917 and 1922. After World War I, the biggest impact on the Navy came from the Defense Act of 1925 that saw a reduction in spending for all Swedish armed forces. This hit the army the hardest. The Navy was somewhat spared, but it decreased the number of new ships it would get. The 1925 Act saw the Navy organization for wartime divided into 6 naval districts to clarify the area of responsibility. Those were Norrland, Östkusten, Sydkusten, Västkusten, Öresund, Gotland, and also the coastal navy, Kustflottan. At this time the Navy had 10 coastal defense ships, 5 cruisers, 12 destroyers and 19 submarines, and some other smaller ships. The 3 coastal defense ships in the class Sverige were modern for its time. A naval committee in 1926 suggested that the Navy should keep its force ratio, with some new ships being built. They suggested that between 1927 and 1933, 1 aircraft carrier should be built, and other lighter ships should be constructed. And between 1933 and 1938, a new fast coastal defense ship should be built. A drawing for a fast coastal defense ship was prepared, but already in 1928 the proposed speed of 24 knots would be slower than the ships it was supposed to outrun, namely the Deutschland class of heavy cruisers. So it was back to the drawing board. In 1930 a new proposal came up, project named 3 kronor. This would be a ship with 28 centimeters main armament, but still having a speed of 24 knots, as the cost for building faster ships were just too high. But the world was in a wide financial depression, so there was little interest of building a new heavy ship. The Navy still wanted big ships. Between 1930 to 1936, naval staff debated and they continued to want a larger heavy fleet armed with at least 28 cm guns. There were some others who advocated for a smaller coastal fleet, but nothing was decided. In 1936, Admiral Deschamps was assigned to evaluate what the Navy needed. He suggested a ship of 8,000 tons, armed with 6 21 cm guns and a speed of 30 knots. Officers in his group suggested that 2 such ships should be built and 2 cruisers. However, if this proposal was rejected, a lighter fleet with 12 destroyers able to operate on the high seas, 12 coastal destroyers and 36 submarines should be built. A pretty ambitious plan. By 1937, these suggestions had been declined, and the task of determining the future of the Navy went to the defense staff. High-speed heavy ships were just too costly, so perhaps a lighter coastal fleet was better and more in line with the money available. Meanwhile, the Navy had ever-increasing plans. Some suggested even pocket battleships of 17,000 tons. The government had stated that any coastal defense ship program could not exceed 35 million Swedish kronor. The pocket battleship itself would have costed 100 million Swedish kronor, so that was not realistic. What the Navy wanted grew further apart from what was realistic in terms of money, and what was actually needed. In the end, 2 cruisers would be ordered, HMS Tre Kronor and HMS Göta Lejon, with a speed of 33 knots and 15.2 cm main armament. But they would only enter service after the war in 1947, even though the building started in 1943. What did the Navy get until 1939? HMS Gotland was commissioned in 1934. It was a seaplane carrier that in a pinch could carry 8 J-9 biplanes, a Hawker Osprey variant. Those would be removed in 1943 as they were obsolete. However, this ship would play a small part in the sinking of Bismarck, but I will get to that a bit later. Between 1925 and 1939, some 10 new submarines and 6 destroyers were built and added to the Navy. By 1939, the Navy was old, somewhat run down, and still in need of modern ships, and more of them. Only around 40% of the ships were considered modernization. The backbone of the Swedish Navy were the Sverige class of ships, coastal defense ships of around 7,000 tons unloaded, with an armor of up to 200 mm, carrying 4 28 cm guns and 8 secondary 15.2 cm guns. The speed was somewhere between 23 to 25 knots. They were all coal-fired ships. As the ships had to be fast for its time, that excluded armor under the waterline. Instead, 13 watertight compartments were put in place to limit any damage from torpedoes and mines. They were ships somewhat similar to a light cruiser in size. In speed they were slower, but the armament were on par with a heavy cruiser like Admiral Scheer, and it had a thicker armor than even that ship. A battleship light, you might call them. 3 ships had been built until 1925. HMS Sverige came into service in 1917, HMS Drottning Victoria in 1921, and HMS Gustav V in 1922. In 1914 it had been decided to build a total of 8 such ships, but by the Defense Act of 1925 the additional 5 ships were postponed indefinitely. A modernization program started for the 3 ships in the 20s, when the front mast was replaced by a tripod housing a new central sight and rangefinder. The ships also had 2 underwater torpedo tubes that were removed. 1931 to 1933 came the next modernization phase. They would add extra anti-aircraft guns to the ships, and the heavy smoke from the fore-funnel had been a problem for the new sighting system, so they came up with some rather innovative solutions. For HMS Sverige, they bent the fore-funnel almost from the base back and then up. HMS Drottning Victoria, they only angled the top funnel a bit. And for HMS Gustav V, they combined 2 funnels into one, making all the 3 ships very distinctive in silhouette. In 1938, all boilers had to be replaced, and then they switched from coal to oil. Older coastal defense ships in the class Äran, which were HMS Äran, built in 1901, HMS Tapperheten, also built in 1901, and HMS Manligheten, built in 1903, were also modernized. They had a max speed of 16.5 knots, armed with 21 cm guns, and by 1939 they were very old. The modernization between 1938 and 1941 meant they got for the first time, artillery systems for aiming, which had previously been lacking. They also got anti-aircraft guns. How old these ships were can be highlighted by the fact that when they fired HMS Äran's main guns in 1939, the vibrations were so bad that they damaged the ship, and the guns were not used for 6 months after that. She had actually not been in service since 1933. And this is similar for HMS Tapperheten, who had not been in service since 1929. HMS Manligheten was modernized during 1941, getting also an artillery central for aiming, new boilers, and the older secondary guns were replaced with anti-aircraft guns. And also the bow was extended. The final coastal defense ship was HMS Oscar II that came into service 1907. It had a 21 cm main armament with a speed of 18 knots. It was modernized and got the old targeting system from HMS Sverige. Added was anti-aircraft guns, and the boilers were replaced with a mix of coal boilers and oil boilers. Decommissioned. In 1940, the coastal battleship Vasa was decommissioned. It was simply too worn down to be modernized. It had been built in 1901 and had not been modernized or armed since 1924. Two older destroyers, HMS Munin, built in 1911, and HMS Vale, built in 1907, were also decommissioned. But other destroyers in the same series were kept in service because of the severe lack of destroyers that were needed for convoy duties. During the war, some 8 older submarines were decommissioned. However, 2 of those were because of accidents. HMS Illern, built in 1918, sank in 1943 after a collision, and HMS Ulven, that entered service in 1931, sank in 1943. New ships 1939 to 1945. Procurement abroad. At the start of the war, the need for new ships were critical. Sweden had the possibility to build new ships, but that would take time, and the ships were needed sooner rather than later. Some older ships were not in any condition to function in a modern sea warfare. Buying ships abroad seemed the quickest way to achieve this. As the major part of the European powers were at war in 1939, they would probably not want to sell ships to Sweden, so Sweden turned to the US, still neutral at that time. The Navy were most interested in getting guns, among them anti-aircraft guns, and also the possibility to get cruisers and torpedo boats. USA were not that interested, and when Germany invaded Norway and Denmark in 1940, the slim possibility of buying from USA turned into it's not possible at all. The other power that possibly could sell war material to Sweden was Italy, who were not at war in 1939. Italy was not the first or even the second choice, but beggars can't be choosers. So a delegation went to Italy and bought 4 smaller destroyers and 4 torpedo boats. And that ended the import of ships to the Swedish Navy. If they wanted more, they had to build them themselves. Here is a table of the total import of war materials. In total, the Swedish Army, Navy and Air Force would spend about 4.2 billion Swedish kronor in procurement, and about 13% of that was imported material. For the Navy, about 10% of the money was spent on importing ships or other materials. The rest was spent on building them themselves, for a total cost of 450 million Swedish kronor. 450 million Swedish kronor in 1940 is equivalent to about 11 billion Swedish kronor today, or around 1.1 billion euros. One problem with constructing ships in Sweden was the lack of some resources. The Navy in 1941 wanted to build 2 cruisers, Tre Kronor and Göta Lejon. But their construction would require 40% of the total amount of molybdenum available. Therefore, these 2 ships were delayed and construction started only in 1943, with the ships entering service in 1947. Several different kinds of destroyers were in service with the Swedish Navy. Worth to mention are the Gothenburg class of destroyers, if for nothing else their top speed of 39 knots. 2 such destroyers were built during the war, both delivered in 1941. They were HMS Gävle and HMS Norrköping, the class having in total 5 destroyers, the other 3 being built before the war. The Visby-class destroyers were also fast, 39 knots, and with a displacement of 1200 tons. They had 12 cm guns that could do some damage. They were after the war converted to frigates. 4 destroyers were built and put into service between 1943 and 44. They were HMS Visby, HMS Sundsvall, HMS Helsingborg and HMS Kalmar. The second type of ships that were in high demand were minesweepers, because there were many and dense minefields around the Swedish coast. A number of those ships were built partly in wood, in the so-called M series of ships. 24 of them were built during the war with a length of 25 meters. Impressively enough, some of those were not decommissioned until 2004. Bigger minesweepers in the Arholma class had 14 ships built, 13 during the war and 1 in 1937. They were 56 meters long, displacement of 400 tons, carrying either mines or depth charges or a combination of them both, with a top speed of 18 knots. They were decommissioned in the 60s. By the end of the war, 14 new destroyers had been built, 26 minesweepers, 11 submarines, and a variety of smaller vessels. Here is a table of the Swedish Navy and how it rearmed between 1939 to 1945. Most of the new ships were destroyers and minesweepers and torpedo boats. Small ships for a light navy. Status in 1939. The Navy had some 2,700 kilometers of coast to defend. So the Navy had its work cut out for it, and at some point even the major ships, the coastal defense ships, took part in the convoy duty. Kustflottan, the armored fist of the Navy, had 2 coastal defense ships, 1 seaplane cruiser, 6 destroyers, 1 mine ship and 8 submarines. It was the main fleet. The different naval districts had the following ships attached to them. Ostkusten, 1 coastal defense ship, 4 smaller destroyers, 2 minesweepers and 6 older torpedo boats, and 1 torpedo cruiser. Gotland had 1 torpedo cruiser and 2 small destroyers. Sydkusten had 1 coastal defense ship, 3 submarines, 2 large minesweepers. Öresund, 4 small patrol boats. And Västkusten, 1 coastal defense ship, 2 smaller destroyers, 3 submarines and 2 minesweepers. Among the destroyers, it is worth mentioning that older destroyers like HMS Vidar, built in 1909, took part and saw service all during the war. Swedish operational doctrine during World War II. To understand the naval doctrine, we have to go back quite a number of years, all the way back to 1808 and 1809. Before 1808, the Swedish Navy had to keep their routes open, especially to Finland, something that required big ships. After Russia attacked and conquered Finland in 1808-1809, and Sweden having a new king who preferred a defense inland, what was the point of the navy? Instead of big ships, it turned into a force with smaller ships fighting in the archipelagos of Stockholm and some few other important places close to the coast. This was reinforced by, for example, the Monitor built by John Ericsson in 1865. That is the same John Ericsson who built the Monitor during the Civil War in USA. Only after 1875 did they start building bigger ships again, and by 1905 the union with Norway had broken, which meant that Norway could potentially become a new enemy. So armored ships, coastal defense ships were needed and built. As mentioned before, coastal defense ships were small in size, like a light cruiser, but much more heavily armed. It was a battleship light that could still navigate the archipelago, fight both there and out at sea. The task of a coastal defense ship was to take on the cruiser. Now, what was the Swedish doctrine during World War II? Well, that is a difficult question to answer. As far as I have found, there are no specific Swedish naval doctrines for World War II. That concept really came into being after World War II. Before this, it's very hard to find anything written down as the doctrine. But we can infer the doctrine from the heavy fleet doctrine of 1900 and the light fleet doctrine of the post-World War II Navy. Regarding an invasion. The main fleet is Kustflottan, the coastal fleet. It is the strongest of the navy, the fist if you will. It will be supported by local squadrons used for local defense, until Kustflottan can arrive. Kustflottan would not have parity with most enemy fleets, so speed was key, and by 1939 the speed of the main coastal defense ships were not there anymore. In general, one can say with some confidence that if the region where Kustflottan were based at would be attacked, the aim would be to slow down the enemy as far out as possible. Closer to the coast, the main ships would attack and then pull back to the archipelago, where smaller ships and what was left of the Kustflottan would engage the enemy again. If one of the naval districts were attacked, they would try something similar, but probably closer to the coast, and when, or rather if, Kustflottan arrived, it would attack the invasion fleet from the flank, probably pretty close to the coast. Another big part of the Navy doctrine was the concept fleet in being, simply working as a deterrent for enemies, without actually being used. In 1941, the Navy suggested the following doctrine, or tactic if you will. Furthest out to sea, light cruisers, large destroyers, submarines and naval aircraft would meet the enemy. Between that force and the coast would be the larger coastal defense ships and destroyers of type Romulus, the Italian destroyers we bought. At the coast, gunboats, torpedo boats, coastal boats and coastal submarines. The doctrine or tactic was never realized, as the cruisers were not there during the war. However, it can give an idea what the kind of naval warfare Sweden would have used if attacked. The other main part of the naval doctrine or task were escort duties. To give an idea, in total some 700,000 hours were spent on escort duties, escorting a total of 17,796 ships. This was the main operation of the Swedish Navy, and this is also why so many more smaller ships were built and not any really big ones. What did foreign navies think about the Swedish Navy? The only realistic attacker would have been Germany, and so what they thought is a bit interesting. In 1940, Germany had done a very sketchy study that concluded that the main naval forces were located in Stockholm and Karlskrona, and only weak naval units were placed in the south-southwest of the country. As they saw it, the Navy had 8 armored ships, 2 modern, 1 aircraft carrier, 2 cruisers and 15 submarines. The aircraft carrier, I suppose, would have been HMS Gotland, the seaplane carrier. They also identified correctly that many of the ships were not modern. They could not stand up against a major power. In 1943, the German Navy warned that a war with Sweden that weren't over quickly would shut down the submarine training grounds in the Baltic, in effect ending the Battle of the Atlantic. They also warned that they could not take the harbors the Swedish Navy might use. Later war studies proposed to blockade the ports where the Swedish Navy were based with mines and smaller ships. They, however, saw that the addition of the Swedish Navy to the German one would be a great addition. In general, and rightly so, the Germans concluded that they could knock out the Swedish Navy, but if it was not done quickly, Swedish ships would do some damage to the German Navy, at least to some extent. And if it shut down the training grounds of the submarine crews in the Baltic, that would have a major detrimental effect on the German Navy. Some events of particular interest. 19th of May 1941, the battleship Bismarck and Prince Eugen is moving out of the Baltic Sea to hit the Atlantic convoys. Meanwhile, HMS Gotland, the seaplane cruiser in the Swedish Navy, is conducting exercises in Kattegat. When it spots both ships, it follows the German task force for 2 hours, reporting the course and speed. The information is relayed to Stockholm. And as far as I can see, a man called Ternberg, working for the Secret Sea Bureau, hands this information over to the Norwegian military attaché, who then informs the British naval attaché Henry Denham, who then informs London. Who informed whom is not really certain, but that the ships did report to German ships and Britain was informed about it is pretty certain. And that was the small contribution of HMS Gotland to the sinking of the battleship Bismarck. HMS Ulven, the lost submarine. 15th of April 1943, the submarine is taking part in exercises outside Gothenburg. The exercise consists of surface ships trying to avoid the submarine and HMS Ulven trying to use practice torpedoes to score a kill. 10 minutes past 6 in the evening, a detonation of a mine is heard. They started searching for it the next day, when another submarine, HMS Draken, was fired upon by the German ship Aldkirk. The HMS Ulven was not found until the 5th of May at 52 meters depth. The submarine is later salvaged. They can see that it has struck a mine and the whole crew has been killed more or less instantly. The area for the exercise had been swept for mines in 1942, so it was assumed it was cleared of mines. However, during the search, a number of mines were found and defused in the area. This was one of the biggest naval disasters for the Swedish Navy during World War II, when 33 men died. Other interesting events are the Fislander affair and the Hårsfjärd disaster. I made separate videos about those and I will post a link below. Conclusion. You can sometimes get the impression that Sweden had powerful naval task forces roaming the sea, a great deterrent to any enemy, and that is simply not true. The Swedish Navy could do some damage in the right circumstances against Germany, but one have to remember that the heaviest ships were really either very old or getting there. The Sverige class were semi-modern, but they were slow. However, with their size and an archipelago to hide in, they could do some damage. The other coastal defense ships were really hopelessly outdated, dating all the way back to the beginning of the 1900s. The Navy had an ambition of a sea fleet. In reality, it was a coastal fleet, turning into a light fleet. That said, some of the ships were able, especially the destroyers and some of the submarines. minesweepers saw long extended service into 2004. But that is as far as it goes. For the Baltic Sea, it was a competent fleet, if small. It had a very long coastline to defend. But it was not a bad fleet in being, acting as a deterrent. However, any major power would have overcome it, but while struggling it would have done some damage. This turned out to be quite a long video and I still have only scratched the surface. I hope you liked it. If you did, please like and subscribe. Leave a comment if you want and I will try and respond as soon as possible.